Yo, how's it going, guys? Welcome back to another book review, and today's episode we'll be looking at The First Man in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Believe it or not, this is the first H.G. Wells book I've ever read, even though he has more popular ones like The War of the Worlds, Time Machine, Island of Dr. Moreau. However, I've picked up this one first. Just something interested me about it. I really like the front cover of it. It has some beautiful colors. And the title, The First Man in the Moon, I was wondering exactly what they found in the moon, because it's not the first man on the moon, it's the first man in the moon, which sounds a little bit more interesting. Let's get into the blurb. Thanks to the discovery of an anti-gravity metal, Cavorite, two Victorian Englishmen traveled to the moon, where they encountered the extraordinary underground world of the Selenites, insect-like aliens living in a rigidly organized hive society. So, short and sweet little blurb. Let's get into the plot. So the plot pretty much follows Mr. Bedford, and the whole book is from the first-person view of Mr. Bedford, who is a businessman in London, and he travels out to the countryside next to Kent to get some peace and quiet so that he can work, pretty much. And while he's there, he meets a Mr. Cavor, who is a scientist, and who's managed to discover a new element which he calls Cavorite. And pretty much what Cavorite does is that it's an anti-gravity metal. Pretty much it can negate the forces of gravity. So by working together, they are able to create this ball, pretty much, the one that you can see on the front cover here, which is made up of steel and Cavorite and also glass. And it has panels of Cavorite, which pretty much when you cover up the panel, there is no gravity, but when you open up the panel, then gravity pushes you in that direction, and what that allows them to do is travel through space, pretty much, because they just open or close the panel in the specific direction that they want to go. So they use that to eventually get to the moon, and when they get to the moon, it's just about daylight coming up, and when the sunshine actually hits them, they discover that very quickly plants start growing everywhere all around them, and it's a lot more different than what they expected the moon to be, because they expected it just to be a barren wasteland, pretty much, just rock everywhere. But then it turns out that plants grow incredibly quickly, and the plants are massive, they're huge, and then they find these giant worms that are roaming the environment, and eventually they stumble across aliens in the form of pretty much like 5-foot tall ants, but every ant looks different, and they very quickly discover that the aliens may not be as friendly as they initially think they could be, and that's where I'm gonna leave it off. It's not a very complicated book, to be honest. It's a very simple idea. You know, they travel to the moon and they meet aliens there. However, H.G. Wells does a very good job at explaining the environment, explaining the wonder, pretty much, of when they meet the aliens, and the wonder of all the plants and pretty much just the whole environment that gets created. It's very well done by H.G. Wells. I would say it's not the most exciting book I have read compared to some of the other ones on the channel. To be honest, out of the book reviews I've done so far on the channel, this book is probably my least favorite out of all of them. But that's not to say it's a bad book, because by no means is it a bad book. I just did not enjoy it quite as much as I've enjoyed all my other books that I've reviewed. I think part of that is to do with the fact that it is quite a simple concept. But even then, in my last book review of Sirius was quite a simple concept, but I really enjoyed it. I think maybe some people would enjoy this book more than me, and that's the beauty of books, is everyone has a different experience with them. But that being said, I did really enjoy it, and I did enjoy pretty much when they meet the aliens, how they interact with the aliens, and the ending of the book especially was really good. And I think partially that the ending of the book was really good because the middle part of the book lacked a bit for me. But I will let you experience that yourself, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the spoiler section of this review, because obviously I don't want to spoil the book for you before we get there. But that will be it for why you should read this book. I'll just add in also, it's obviously, the author is obviously H.G. Wells, who is so highly respected for making great books, so that's another reason you should read it. It's an SF Masterworks, so obviously it's done something right. I'm not saying all SF Masterworks books are good, but if it's on here, then it's obviously doing something right. And it's a very simple adventure, but it's still one worth reading. H.G. Wells does a great job explaining everything. So definitely give this book a read. But now let's get into the spoiler section. Go read the book, then come back, and listen to everything I've got to say. If you feel like you want to add a bit more to my discussion or the things I've mentioned, feel free to do so in the comments. Then I can reply. We can have a discussion about it. Maybe you disagree with some of the stuff I say. If that's the case, feel free to comment down below. But the first thing I'm going to talk about, as usual, is my favorite chapter. And my favorite chapter was the second to last one. I don't remember what number that was. It was the second to last chapter, and the reason for it was because we get to learn so much more about the aliens, because obviously throughout the book, Mr. Bedford, being the narrator, is actually quite reluctant to interact with the aliens. He doesn't want anything to do with them, as we find out. And so I actually preferred the last few chapters of the book where we see it from the perspective of Mr. Cavor, because he actually interacts with the aliens and we actually get to find out more about them. And that's why I think this was the best part of the book, where we actually get to see the aliens, which is why the second to last chapter was my favorite one. We get to learn about how the aliens work, about the work that they actually do, about how they live, about the environment they live in, about the things they do when they're not working, which is quite interesting as well. And I don't remember if it was in the second to last chapter or in the last chapter where we get to meet pretty much the supreme alien, but that was quite cool as well. And I liked when the alien pretty much decided, you know what, these humans seem pretty strange that they just have wars between each other. I thought that was quite interesting as well, because just because our civilization has wars on Earth doesn't mean that other civilizations would have had wars where they are. Maybe they're like so what's the word? So evolved to the point where they see war as absolutely unnecessary and they just don't have any war left. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. So I thought that was some interesting questions that were raised. Some things I want to talk about. I really liked the design of the spaceship. I really liked the fact that you just like release the panels and it forces gravity to push or pull you that specific direction. When I did a little bit of research on the Wikipedia page, I think it was, it said that the book received criticism from other authors at the time because apparently the concept wasn't very realistic. And yes, of course it's not realistic, but I don't really see why that was a problem. I get it's science fiction, and a big part of science fiction is creating believable stuff that you think could genuinely work scientifically. It's just that we've just not progressed far enough to actually discover it, but it could work, and that seems to be the case in most of the books I've read. Whereas this one, yeah, I agree that Cavor in itself is not very scientifically plausible, or maybe it is, but the whole concept of how the spaceship was created with the panels being revealed isn't very scientifically correct, I wouldn't say. However, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was quite a fun touch on it, especially considering what this book is going for. I think this book is going for quite a fun adventure to the moon. It's not meant to be incredibly like scientifically complex or anything, so I quite enjoyed the spaceship. And I also enjoyed when the spaceship returns to Earth, when the kid goes into it and gets blasted off and is forever left in space. I just thought, yeah, that's what you get, mate, for going into a random spaceship that isn't yours and touching all kinds of buttons. Like, that's exactly what you deserve. I felt no pity for that boy. I just thought it was really funny that he just got blasted off into space, even though he probably died a very slow, painful death from hunger being stuck in space. But I really enjoyed the concept that when I don't know if all the panels are open or if all of them are closed, or what the exact explanation was, but the fact that you could just like sleep in the spaceship just like in zero gravity. Obviously you could do that in any spaceship as long as there's space for you to do so. I just thought it was a nice little touch on the book, and yeah, I really liked the spaceship. Another thing I want to talk about is in the plot section I said that plants grow rapidly when exposed to the sunlight on the moon, and I thought that was quite interesting because obviously when they first arrive, it's just rock everywhere, but then very quickly all kinds of plants start to grow. And I really like that because it's just, especially back in 1901, I'm sure they had like telescopes and they had good knowledge of what the moon is or other planets already, even though it was over 100 years ago. It just added that little bit of mysteriousness and wonder to the moon, because we see the moon from here, or maybe we see it through a telescope or whatever, like resources are available online to zoom in on the moon, etc. However, like, it is quite interesting that you'd get there and then it's completely different from the knowledge you had of it so far. I really enjoyed that because it just added a bit of fun to the book. And it was like, whoa, this is what the moon is. That's crazy. Especially, let's say, if this book was aimed at children 100 years ago and they didn't really have any knowledge of what the moon is. They just look up at the sky and see the moon, and then Mr. Cavor and Bedford land on the moon, and then just plants start growing everywhere. It's very fun, and I really enjoyed it because of that. But speaking about that a little bit, I wanted to talk about how I wonder the book obviously never raises this because it's totally out of the scope of the book really. But I wanted to talk about whether this the whole plant's not being known as being on the moon, whether that's a cover up by the government, like as a world government, because think about it. You have very good telescopes, and we have a lot of material online, like let's say on YouTube. You've got a lot of videos of the moon be like very close up and images of the moon, and we always see it as just like rocks. Same with Mars, for example. But you wonder if it's just a cover up by the government because obviously Mr. Bedford and Cavor got to the moon, and then they found out that it wasn't just rock. There's plants literally everywhere. Like you cannot miss all of the green that is on the moon. So it's like it makes you wonder, like if you go proper conspiracy theory style, which I don't usually do. I just thought it was quite fun to maybe consider that whether the government is just hiding from us the fact that there's a crap ton of life actually on the moon and maybe on Mars as well. Like maybe there's aliens all around the place that they've discovered. They're just keeping a cover up, which is showing by the fact that they thought it was just rocks on the moon, but then as soon as they get there, it's very obvious it's not just rocks on the moon. However, no one ever told them that. They were always told 100% it's just rocks everywhere. So I thought that was quite a fun theory that I just made up on the spot yesterday. And yeah, I thought that was quite good. Moving on a bit to the Selenites, which are the aliens on the moon, I really liked their design. I liked the fact that they were about 5 foot high, so they were just a little bit shorter than an average human. However, each of them looks completely different. Like they all have like features of an ant. However, they all look completely different, and it's mostly based on the role that they do. We find out that obviously their civilization is very much based on everyone has a specific job and they just stick to that job. For example, a translator, a scriber to write information in a book, just a typical machinery worker, or just a plant grower, like all that different stuff. But once you've got your specialization, that's you set for life. That is the job you're gonna do. And I like that for each job you've got to do, your body kind of what's the correct word? Your body adapts to the best kind of form you can take to do that job. So for example, the workers that have to remember a lot of information, their heads will be really big. Or the workers that actually use their hands a lot, like they'll have a lot more developed bodies for the sort of work that they are doing. So I really enjoyed that. I thought the Selenites were quite interesting in the way that they operate, especially the translators, how Mr. Cavor and Bedford are approached by two aliens, and the job of one of them is to learn the language that the aliens speak. The aliens being Cavor and Bedford in this scenario is to learn English, and then the other one's job is pretty much to remember all of the information that the first one learned. I thought that was it was an interesting way of making them operate, and it makes logical sense because you usually have the person that interacts with a tourist, and then you have another person who may write down everything or may make sure that everything's organized properly. I find that in my job quite a lot, where we go in pairs, but then I do all of the work and another person just backs me up, or they do most of the work and then I just make sure that they've not missed anything. So yeah, I really enjoyed the way the Selenites work. And like I said, what part was it? I said in the favorite chapter, I also obviously really enjoyed their supreme Selenites. I don't remember what they were called, but I enjoyed the whole like ceremony of having Mr. Cavor go up to, like being carried up to the supreme Selenite being, and it being like this big like ceremony of sorts. I really enjoyed that. I wanted to touch up on exactly the work that the Selenites do, or more specifically how I think it was on page 189 or 188, one of the two, but it pretty much explains how the workers lie down on the floor and just pretty much are asleep until they are needed again to work. Pretty much. So if they have no work to do, they will just lie down asleep and wait until it is their time to actually wake up and do more work. I think they are drugged in order to stay asleep until they are needed again. And I just thought that was, well, because let's say they are just ants and they don't have like any sort of intelligence or anything, then fair enough, you're just sleeping doing nothing because, well, there is nothing for you to do. However, if they do have a evolved brain to the point where they can think for themselves and they actually have interests and similar, then it's quite like dystopian and quite scary to think that, you know, you're literally just going to work, you do the work you do, and then you fall asleep until you are needed again to wake up and do more work. Especially, I don't know if it was a big theme in 1901, maybe it was, but nowadays, you know, when people say that they have no free time because they just go to work and then they come back from work, they watch TV for 2 hours, then they go to bed, wake up again, go to work, come back home 2 hours, go to sleep again. So I thought that was like a little bit of a connection there where the Selenites only are awake when they're working, and then when they're not working, they go back to sleep. And one of the main Selenites that Cavor speaks to explains that that's because they don't want them roaming about, because they're no use when they're just wandering about. They've got no job when they do so. So I thought that was really interesting. And speaking a bit more about that, I've actually got a quote here that I'll speak about. To drug the worker one does not want and toss him aside is surely far better than to expel him from his factory to wander starving in the streets. So again, that's a bit more about the dystopia of how the Selenites operate, because what they're saying is, and I would say this is probably like from the higher up people in the society, they're like, yeah, sure, we'll drug the workers because it's better for them to just lie about doing nothing than for them to go begging or for them to be starving in the street. It's much better for them to just pretty much be dead until they are needed again. And that just develops a bit more on the idea of like not having any time for yourself and not being able to do anything with that time. And it just sounds horrendous, especially if, let's say, human society evolves, if you can call it evolving to that point. Like, it will just be a really, really terrible world. But the last thing I want to talk about, and I was quite critical of this, right, is I did not enjoy Bedford as the main character of the story. I thought Cavor would have made for a way more interesting character. Not necessarily because he in himself is incredibly interesting, but because Mr. Bedford is always really antagonistic towards the aliens, which I don't necessarily blame him for. You know, he is on an alien planet that he doesn't know anything about, if you can call a moon a planet, and pretty much the Selenites have showed up, they have weapons, and they are poking him with the weapons, pretty much saying, go forward, right, keep going. Like, pretty much they are prisoners of the Selenites, so I don't blame him for being slightly antagonistic. However, Cavor keeps telling him, like, we know nothing about their civilization, just play along, we can find out so much about them. And especially if you don't obey, there's not really much you can do about it. Like, what are you going to do, just run away and be stuck on the moon? You'll eventually get found anyway. And obviously Mr. Bedford manages to make it to his spaceship, and he manages to make it back to Earth, so it works out for him. However, I just really did not like how antagonistic he was towards the Selenite, considering that as the reader of the book, I want to find out as much as I can about the Selenites. And I get it, if you just played along with the Selenites the whole time, some readers would be like, well, this isn't really realistic that he's just playing along with the Selenites, even though he knows nothing about them. They could just take him down to eat him in a minute, like, could kill him at any moment. However, I did think that Cavor should be the main character because, as I explained earlier, my favorite chapters in the book, and therefore my favorite part of the book, was the last few chapters where it's all from more or less the first person perspective of Cavor, because that's when he actually goes down to meet the aliens, and that's when we find out the most about the civilization that they have. And I just wish we had more of that. I pretty much wish the book was longer, or just from the perspective of Cavor, so that we can find out so much more about these aliens. In a way, you could say the less we learn about the aliens, the better as well, because then it lets us make assumptions and theorize about more things, and I enjoy doing that a lot, as you may know. However, I do think the book would have been a lot better if it was from Cavor's perspective, because he actually interacts with the aliens a lot more and cooperates with them. And like, because think about it, let's say the book just ended when Mr. Bedford arrives back on Earth and he's taken in and he's given food and etc., and then he sells off his gold uh, materials that he was able to get from the moon. Let's say the book ends there. Think of how disappointing that would be, because we learned so little about the civilization on the moon. Or maybe it wouldn't even be disappointing to most readers. It would just be like, okay, we didn't really learn much. It was a very simple adventure of he goes to the moon, he sees some aliens, he comes back after running away from them. Fine, fair enough. But after that, obviously, Mr. Bedford finds another person who's been getting radio transmissions from Mr. Cavor on the moon, and that's when we find out all of the information about the aliens, about what Mr. Cavor's experiences were like on the moon. And like I'm saying, that's my favorite part, and I just think it would have been so much better if Mr. Cavor was then the main character from the very start. Especially that I did get annoyed at Mr. Bedford sometimes. Like when the Selenites pricked him and he got really annoyed and started punching the Selenite, I was like, what the hell are you doing? Just because he pricked you doesn't mean that he's your enemy. Like, I know he pricked you, but that was your fault for not going forward, right? So I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking about it wrong, but I think the book would have been way better if Cavor was the main character. But that will be all I want to talk about for this book. I think this review is a little bit shorter than my other ones, and that's mostly just because, like I'm saying, it was a very simple adventure. I didn't really find that much I wanted to talk about. I still found a few interesting things, especially the conspiracy theory of the cover-up by the government. I thought that was very interesting. But if you've got any other topics you want to talk about in the book, then feel free to put them in the comments. I'll be happy to discuss them. I know there was a chapter of when Mr. Bedford gets back into a spaceship and is traveling towards the Earth, and this chapter doesn't really relate to the plot in any way. It's just Mr. Bedford pretty much talking to himself as the narrator within the spaceship as they're traveling back. And I know I've not touched upon that chapter at all, but it was mostly because I didn't really have much to say about it. Wasn't an interesting chapter? Yeah, it definitely was, and it was quite funky because he's kind of breaking the fourth wall without breaking the fourth wall. It's a bit bizarre, but yeah, I just didn't really have anything to say about it. Was it a fun chapter? Definitely, I really enjoyed it. Just didn't really have any specific topic I wanted to talk about with that chapter. But it was quite cool, I guess. But yeah, that will do it for another book review. First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Definitely worth a read. Like I'm saying, not the most interesting book I've ever read, not my favorite by any means, but it was still worth a shot. It's not a really long book, it's like 200 pages, so definitely give it a shot. It's a H.G. Wells book, so if you're going through all of them, you might as well go for this one. But that will do it for this episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next book review.